Hello students, and welcome to this class of Schools of Sociological Theory. And today we're going to talk about the conflict theory with a special focus on Coser's contributions towards conflict theory. Louis Coser, along with Ralph Dahrendorf, contributed immensely towards the conflict perspective, and specifically he laid emphasis on the revival of the conflict perspective, which in a way in the 1950s and 60s was not a dominant perspective for the fact that it was functionalism that was the most dominant perspective. But Louis Coser, with the help of his book The Functions of Social Conflict, written in 1956, tries to revive the conflict perspective. So let's have a look about what were his major points that he comes across, that he puts across through his books, The Functions of Social Conflict. So as you see here today, I will quickly introduce you to this. We shall talk about Louis Coser as a conflict theorist, whether he fits into the definition of a conflict theorist. Secondly, his contribution towards conflict theory with the help of the functions of social conflict and its impact on the conflict perspective as a whole. So looking here, where I started off over here, that Louis Coser in his book The Functions of Social Conflict presents the neglect of sociology towards conflict. So for a long time, conflict as a perspective was not being used in sociology, mainly because of the predominance of the functionalist perspective. Coser emphasized in the functions of social conflict as an interactive process and depicts conflict as a form of socialization. So Louis Coser talks about social conflict as something that is very important in society, that we can't neglect it, and that it is a social conflict which is an interactive process, and in a way he compares this as a type of socialization that takes place in society to the refinement of society. He also feels that no group can be entirely harmonious. We can't say at any point of time that a group is living in perfect harmony, because if we assumed so, then it would lack process and structure. That means there is something missing in such a type of society, and therefore conflict is an essential element of society. And thus he looks at this and applies it in the context of groups, and he says that any group, its formation is a result of both an association and a disassociation, so that both conflict and cooperation serve as a social function. So let's look at basically the core of this book, The Functions of Social Conflict, is here for us to see. The functions of social conflict, as you see, he first starts by defining what is conflict. He gives a very comprehensive definition about what is conflict. In a sense, when you compare with Karl Marx and you look at this, and you see that Karl Marx's definition of conflict is more so ever related to the struggle over resources specifically. But here you see that Louis Coser talks about it in a more comprehensive manner when he says that a conflict is a struggle over values and claims to scarce status, power and resources, in which the aims of the opponents are to neutralize. To neutralize means to maintain a status quo, to injure or eliminate the rivals. And thus when he talks about conflict, he first begins with talking about conflict between intergroups and conflict between intragroups. Intergroup means between two or more groups. It would mean a conflict between Hindus and Muslims, or Christians and Hindus, or between India and Pakistan, or between Brahmins and Shudras. That's intergroups. But a conflict intra-group would mean a conflict between Brahmins by themselves, within themselves, conflict between Christians themselves, maybe between a Roman Catholic and a Protestant, and so on. But the most important point here is that for him, conflicts are a part of social life, and there's no denying about this. And conflicts definitely serve a role in society. That is what Louis Coser unearths in this book of his. And you see here, conflicts can then be both covert and overt. He meant covert as subjective. Covert meant that it is at the element of the individual. It is subjective because as an individual you might be undergoing something, you might be unhappy with something, you might be discontent with something at your level. That is subjective. In the process of time, in a way, may become overt, may become objective, may become more visible. It is objective when, as you see the point down, when the subjective becomes objective, the conflict becomes intense because of the common cause and unity. So when many people, like a single worker facing a problem in his company, and another worker also facing, this is at the individual level, it's very subjective. But when two or more workers, so many workers of them face the same problem and they come together and they fight that common cause, this conflict that was covert, subjective at the individual level will become overt or objective and may result into what we see sometimes as strikes or a movement to change something. Thus, going further, we see that Louis Coser talks about social functions of conflict and specifically emphasizes on these three major functions that conflict play. One, it contributes to social change. Two, it brings about innovation. Three, it increases power, especially during the times of war. There can be increase of central power. Like a classic example is, for example, that when we had this Balakot strikes and the Pulwana terror attack, you'll see that when you have the Pulwana attack happening, terror attack happening in India, it suddenly brings all Indians together and it gives power to the ruling governance that they should also, like the people, empower, because people get united together and stand behind the government and say like, yes, we want a revenge. And you'll find it gives the central governance greater power to go and act, and then you see the outcome of it was the Balakot strikes that take place. Going further, we see that in this book again, Coser explores 16 propositions of conflict through functions. He talks about that conflict is a part of relationship and is not necessarily a sign of instability. So when he's talking about conflict, one of his propositions that is that conflict is a sign of stability in a relationship and not instability, because with the help of conflict you can test the strength of a relationship. Because if you can overcome conflicts in relationship, because conflicts are a part and parcel of any type of relationship, and you overcome this and you begin and you sustain and you continue in that relationship, that means your relationship is really strong. Thus, the strength of a relationship is based on the intensity of the conflict. This is what Coser provides us with. He also says that conflict clears the air. It allows for the free behavioral expression of hostile disposition. This might be thought of as a safety valve theory. So it's like a pressure cooker. Conflict can be compared in this analogy where you have people who are suffering, who are undergoing so many things, and things are boiling within. And when they come out on the streets and when they do that different type of strikes or a movement and so on, releasing the pressure from the cooker which was boiling for a long time, that pressure releasing in the form of this conflict is the safety valve that we see where the whistle blows in a pressure cooker. And this is what Coser speaks of. Going further, thus, social conflict helps in establishing boundaries between different groups. And not only that, it also helps in building unity between individual members and determines boundaries of power. So both ways, it creates boundaries between people and it strengthens group cohesion or cohesiveness within a certain group against another when the boundary is created, and it also builds unity between individual members to determine the boundaries of power. So you'll find both ways conflict is beneficial. Thus, this takes us to more propositions given by Louis Coser, and you see he considers the idea that conflict with outside groups tend to increase internal cohesion. For example, India-Pakistan. So I gave you this example earlier about the Pulwama terror attack and how it brings all people of India together, okay, and it increases the internal cohesion or the internal unity among the members because of the conflict with the outside group like Pakistan. Groups engaged in continual struggle with outside groups tend to become intolerant within and are less likely to tolerate even limited dissent. So the classic example is like if you talk about in terms of India, you will see that when we have a struggle that is taking place, like within India, for example, we have this movement for we don't want coal, okay, and when we don't want these coal plants to come into Goa and say we are taking a stand on this, there might be certain groups who may not even tolerate this stand. Okay, so this is what it means, that there is a limited scope for any dissent. Sometimes when you find there is a continual struggle with outside groups, okay, then what happens is we become intolerant towards each other. Conflicts also leads to the formation of coalitions and associations between previously unrelated parties. You must have heard this. Dushman ka dushman dost. An enemy of an enemy is a friend. So example would be your neighbors near your house. For example, if a certain neighbor you are friends with, and there is another neighbor who you are not a friend with. This neighbor of yours is also not talking to you properly. So this neighbor of yours and that neighbor of yours can become friends together, although they must be not in talking terms earlier, but they might become because they have a common enemy. So this type of things also we have Louis Coser talking about, and in a way saying that conflict is functional. But then he also talks about that conflict can be dysfunctional. Coser suggests that conflict tends to be dysfunctional only for the social structures in which there is insufficient toleration or institutionalization of conflict. So when there is no proper way to control the conflict, then conflict becomes a problem. So highly intense conflicts usually therefore threaten to tear apart society and tend to arise only in rigid social structures. So in these circumstances, then conflict is problematic in that given society. Otherwise, conflict has many functions which outweighs the dysfunctions. To conclude today, Coser demonstrates the need for the understanding of conflict in the discipline of sociology. Coser presents an unusual way of looking in conflict. He takes a functionalist perspective to provide us with the varied functions of conflict. So, in a way, Coser is disguising himself as a functionalist and talking about the conflict perspective from the functions that conflict play in society. Thus, Coser indirectly combines the functionalist perspective with the conflict perspective and demonstrates that conflict and cooperation serves a social function. Thank you.